Well, good evening, and we are just a couple minutes away from getting started. Every once in a while, it may be that you're just checking things out. This is a lecture series on humility and leadership, and I'm working with the material that I have been doing from my doctorate work, and my doctorate is now finished. Woohoo! If you didn't hear this, I don't think I explained this yet, but the church very much was excited to celebrate this while I was not quite so much excited, so I was not really looking to make a big deal about these things. So they put out information as far as congratulating me, and what got put out was a little bit mistaken. I did not get a Doctor of Divinity, I got a Doctor of Ministry, and so it's an earned degree. It's intended to help you in ministry. My focus is on really looking at, when you're called to be a leader, how could we cultivate humility for those called to be a leader? I think it's absolutely essential. One of the things that is emerging, especially in the last 20 years, is a deep appreciation of humility and leadership, and also recognizing the importance of humility helping form great leaders. So we are a number of weeks into this. We are only partway into chapter 2 of my dissertation. There's a lot of meat here. There's and my hope is that, you know, if you listen to all of these lectures, you will be challenged in your thinking about humility, challenged in your thinking about leadership, challenged in really growing in a deeper appreciation of the Christian ideal, the biblical ideal of both humility and leadership. And today we are in the middle of word studies, and I laughed about this last week, and you know, in the sense of just one of my challenges with this part of the presentation is I'm hoping to make word studies interesting for you, and you may hear the idea of a word study and go, oh, this sounds like it's going to be dry. But what we looked at last week, and if you weren't able to watch that, you know, these are all both up on the website and on Facebook. You can go back and you can catch up on missed episodes. But what we looked at was the way you approach doing a word study is you want to sit there and you go, okay, so here's this idea that we have of humility. What are the biblical words that get translated as humility? And what we found is that there are two. One word is praus and one word is tapeinos. Now, each of those words represents a word family. What we looked at is that the word praus, though, and primarily is pointing towards the idea of meekness. And when we look at the category of meekness, power under restraint, and then we look at the category that is expressed by the word tapeinos, which is this idea that you would not consider your status to be of significance, and that you would actually think in a lesser status than what you have, that you would, and especially with the word tapaphrsune, which would be the most, tapeinos would be humble, tapaphrsune would be humility, to be humble-minded, that you wouldn't be really concerned about your status. In fact, you'd be willing to step down into a lower status or take on the position of a lower status so that you could help somebody else. That seems to be the main idea that this tapeinos word group is representing. And they're similar. You keep your power under restraint so that you can be kind and gentle toward people. You willingly step down into a lower status so that you can help other people. There's a lot of similarity here, but there's also significant difference, and that difference is something that we find reflected in particular in the ancient world of how they viewed the difference. And that is that in the ancient world, praus was actually a virtue. It was celebrated. Moralists would write about it. They would celebrate an emperor who was benevolent and didn't use his power in abusive ways, or a general who would not be overly harsh in his punishment and restrained his use of power. And that would be things that they would celebrate and look at as a good thing. And they say we should be praus, that's esteemed. Tapenos was an anti-virtue. It was pillared, it was attacked, it was seen as even being dangerous. And part of the argument that I'm making is that you come into this and our modern dictionaries haven't all paid attention to this difference. And this becomes interesting as far as just in the course of study, because there's an idea here, there's a kernel of thought where we're not capturing the biblical worldview because we're not understanding how it was being used in those days. God's word to us is, first of all, God's word to them. And so we need to come and wrestle through and go, why was it that they viewed humility negatively? Why was it that this word group was seen as a negative? And if this one's a virtue and this one's an anti-virtue, obviously there's a difference. And so we are looking at the level of words. There are 8 words that make up the Tapenos word group. There is a total of 34 occurrences of this word group within the New Testament. And one of the things that I've done is I've looked at every single instance, giving a brief analysis of saying, okay, here in the gospel, the adjective gets used this way. Here in the gospel, the noun gets used this way. Here in the writings of Paul. And so we started that last week. And now we're going to finish out Tapenos. And we're going to come to a place of conclusion where I'll just give you just a brief reflection on when we just look at the words in the New Testament and how they get used, what we step away with. And then we're going to do the same thing with the words for leadership. And there are a couple of key points for this. I'm not going to go quite in the deep dive that I've done with the Tapenos word group, but I think you will find it both instructive and even interesting when we think about the words for leader and leadership within the New Testament. So I've been kind of giving a longer introduction of catching up where we've been, and now we're going to dive back in to looking at Tapenos. But before we do, I had, I think, a question. No question?
Oh, you mean from last week?
From last week. I think Vicki Ravely had a comment, and so
it was about whether God needs our company and our whether He needs us. I think was kind of the gist of it.
Well, if you bring it up,
I'm bringing it.
Okay. By the way, if you didn't know this, Sean Bassler is kind of my producer. So she sits in the room with me. We're more than 6 feet apart. We're practicing social distancing, and she's hosting the Facebook page because especially when I don't have my glasses on, I cannot see anything that's getting posted up while I do this. And so we have the question.
I have it. Yeah. I can only express excitement for this study because it's helping me understand better how we individually and corporately are truly beloved, not as children, but as co-equals helping to spread the good news. There's been expression of how her son's not sure about God's existence because God shouldn't need our money or our worship or our company, but I feel that today's lesson could help better explain God's wanting a close relationship with us and why.
Vicki really was expressing appreciation, and it was based on our study of ecclesiology. And big fancy word makes us sound smart, which is just our understanding of the church, our study of the church, and the New Testament really descriptions of what it means to be the people of God, what the church of God is. And I think in particular that as we talked about the difference between who the church is and what the church does, they go together, they're two sides of the same coin. We put emphasis on who we are, and in particular, it's that imagery that we're the bride of Christ. That the story of the Bible isn't so much what we do for God, but that it is the great, passionate love story of God's pursuit and wooing of us. That He comes to redeem His bride, that He comes to rescue us out of the pit, and that He actually lays his life down for us so that we might be adorned with beauty. And that's the part where when we come and we listen and we get up on the balcony and we look down and we say, who are we? And then when we get called into leadership in the church, that we look out and we recognize, I'm always going to fight against just reducing people down into objects. They're persons created in the image of God. They are more than just what they do. I am more than just what I do. My identity begins not in what I do, but in who God says that I am. So, very encouraging to hear just how good theology helps us. So, Vicki, thanks for sharing that. So, I'll share with you as a way of introduction into, one of the just where we are right here as far as talking about this word taperphosune, a combination of the word tepenos along with this word phronen, which is the mind, to be humble-minded, and so then we get the word humility, somebody who is humble-minded, and we're observing the way it gets used in the New Testament, and the dominant usage is through Paul. 6 times we hear it from Paul, and then 1 time in 1 Peter. But one of the instances of Paul actually is recorded in the book of Acts, which was written by Luke. But Luke there is quoting Paul. And this comes to us in Acts chapter 20, where he's giving a testimony to the elders from Ephesus. And I again want to read this. I read this to you at the end of last time. But I serve the Lord with great humility and with tears in the midst of severe testing by the plots of my Jewish opponents. And I'll tell you that sitting in this passage was one of the things that really inspired me and convicted me. I don't think that I completely understand what the New Testament is saying about humility. How is it that the Apostle Paul can actually claim to be humble and be humble? How did he not get tripped up of becoming prideful in his humility? And this is the part where, in our modern conceptions, what I'm arguing is that we primarily think of humility as how we think about ourselves. And so then it really becomes this tricky dance of, okay, so I'm supposed to be humble, but as soon as I become humble, then I become prideful in my humility because I think that I'm actually humble. And that, it's kind of like thinking that you're wise. And the beginning of wisdom is that you know that you're not wise. And so you're sitting there and you're just like, but here he is. One is we believe in inspiration. We believe that Paul is sitting here and he's saying something, and Luke is recording it for us, and he's saying something that was actually verifiably true, and they themselves, because it was in the speech, knew it was true. And it's going to take us a while to get there, because we start with just looking at these words in their biblical context, trying really to just see how do they get used, what's going on. And because we're going to be building this biblical New Testament idea of humility, and one of the things that we're going to come away with today is that beyond just the words, there's some other pieces that we need to put into place if we're really going to capture the idea of taperphosune. And so we won't offer a definition yet today on what really was being said with taperphosune, because there's more work to do to get to that place. And that was one of the things that I wasn't expecting. I was expecting this to be a simple exercise, probably take about 5 pages of my dissertation, and then I'd be moving on. And instead it turned into 50 pages. But that was the part where this is unique new stuff. There's not a lot of scholarship written about this, and that made it fun. Now, one of the things to know is the call to taperphosune, this call to humility as we see it witnessed in the New Testament. It takes place in these contexts about how the Christian community is to live together, to really to embody being the body of Christ, it often takes place in a call of unity in the midst of outside pressure that's coming at the church. And if you've ever experienced this, where it's when everything's easy, it's easy to get along, but when the heat starts to get turned up, and fear and tensions rise, it's a little bit harder to maintain unity. And what we find in the New Testament is that one of the calls to help in the midst of that sort of tension is this call of humility. Instead of starting with yourself and thinking of yourself first and thinking of what other people should be doing to you, you should be sitting there and thinking, okay, how can I position myself to be a help to other people? And immediately as you move away from the focus on me and you move outward and you think about the community, it's going to help build unity. The goal of living in Christian unity and aspiring to humility was the purpose for which Paul asked Christians to consider the humble example of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2. It is evident that Paul, in contrast to the surrounding culture, did not view tapeinos as a deficient mode of thinking, but the very way Christians should consider themselves. And this becomes part of just the observation. The rest of the ancient world, when they heard this word group, tapeinos, they thought of it negatively and they thought it as something that you should avoid. In the New Testament, significantly with Paul, what we find is it is a central virtue, a central characteristic of aspiration, of saying that's what we're aiming for. And this is the part where, at the contest between the Greco-Roman world and the way of Jesus Christ, humility is right at the center of this contest. In Colossians 3:12, Paul presents tapophrosune as an aspirational virtue, a turning point, right where he's getting to this place where he says, okay, you're living a new life. I want you to take off the old self, the way that it was formed by the culture and the way that you were before Jesus. And I want you to put on your new self. And one of the very first things that he talks about, put on the new self made in the image of the Creator. This is the list of complementary virtues that says this is the new self. The very first thing, humility. Humility, kindness, patience, gentleness. And one of the observations is that humility, kindness, patience, gentleness, these are all virtues that help us live into the way of love. Love primarily defined by our actions, not by our feelings. Yes, love leads to some great warm, loving, feelings that just warm our hearts. But the biblical idea of love is much more. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it keeps no record of wrongs. It's demonstrated in the actions and choices that we make. Humility is a key virtue of nurturing and supporting the fundamental command of loving God and loving people. In Colossians 2:18 and 23, this aspirational virtue of humility is presented with a twist. Now, I am giving you every time this word appears in our Greek New Testament. It's when, if you're going to do an extensive study, if you really, this is what you do. In these two places, humility gets presented with a twist. Paul condemned those who presented themselves with false humility. Paul was cautioning the Colossians against false teachers. Humility had the appearance of wisdom, but in denying Christ, they were only living from human commands and teachings. Therefore, they could not claim true wisdom or humility. In 1 Peter 5:5, the one other occurrence in the New Testament of the word tapophrosune, which is taking tapeinos and adding phronin, be humble-minded. Peter was addressing the community with instructions primarily intended for church leaders. Peter David's comments that the inclusion of these instructions were the logical, necessary explanation of how to build within the church solidarity that could actually face the outside persecution that was coming. Same concern that Paul had in Philippians, Peter has in 1 Peter, and they both look in the same direction. And the call is to say, As the heat gets turned up, you're called to live in unity together as the body of Christ. And what is absolutely essential for you to do this is to cultivate and nurture the humble way of Jesus, to be humble-minded in the way that you live your life together. Now, I'll give you, this call of humility is not a call of saying, I want you to think that you're less. It's really a call to say, I don't want you to worry about your status, your privilege, your honor, what's coming to you. I want you to think about how you can position yourself to help other people as they're facing hardship. And when you start thinking of humility in that way, you see just how significant a virtue it is of really bringing together unity. Imagine a community where you walk in and people aren't thinking of themselves first. People aren't trying to climb to the top so that they're honored, that they get their way, that they get exactly what they want. But people are sitting there and they're thinking about, what can I do to help somebody else out? Now remember, if you've been following along, I gave you an image of this, of the game Balloon Stomp. Two different ways of approaching power, two different ways of approaching leadership. One way is might makes right, and it's a zero-sum game, and I got to stomp everybody else's balloons so that I get to the top. And the other way is the only way for all of us to win is for all of us to serve and to allow each other to stomp on our balloons, and to actually help one another do that. That's what's getting pictured here. That way of life that's just an outward-focused, other-centered, not being concerned about my welfare. Where does it come from, that not being concerned? Because I'm absolutely secure that Jesus has me. And this is part of this, the way that humble gets used in the New Testament. It's a call of faith. Humble yourself before the Lord, and He will raise you up. Allow yourself to take the lowly position. Go and sit in the least comfortable chair at the table. Go and sit at the heel instead of the front. Don't be worried about you getting any acclamation. Instead, you try to help some other people be brought up, encouraged, celebrated, honored. And when you do that, and you do it intentionally, and you do it motivated by love, you do it by faith, you're trusting the Father to pick you up. You're trusting God. He has your back. That's what we're getting at with the call of Tapper Forsune. There are 5 remaining instances of this word group, tapenos, in the rest of the New Testament. One is a compound verb, tapaphron. It's found in 1 Peter 3:8. Peter there is giving hortatory instruction. He's calling people, preaching to them, to the whole church, in the face of persecution and suffering, to be united in their witness to the larger society through their love for one another, and to be compassionate and humble. Again, going for unity and how you act, and saying, I want you to act humbly out towards the world and with one another. Compassion and humility are presented as prerequisite attitudes necessary to not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. You know, the command, turn the other cheek. How do we do that? How do we become the type of people that turn the other cheek? Well, humility is one of the virtues that will help. This person looks like they're having a bad day. This person is broken. This person is failing. I don't want to hurt them. I want to help them. Now, put this in the Greco-Roman context, and I'm tipping my hands a little bit of where we're going with this. Humility was literally saying, I want you to take the position of a slave or a servant. In the Greco-Roman world, if somebody above you hit you, you would never hit back. It's not your place in society. You would just take it. Now, what's key here is that this attitude that it will help us not repay evil for evil. We're not thinking that we're of less value. We're not thinking that we are just a lesser person who deserves what we're getting because somebody greater is standing before me. That's not what taperforsune says. Taperforsune says, I'm choosing to take a position as a slave to you, even if I'm of a higher status, not because I'm worthless, but because I want to help you, because Jesus calls me to this, because Jesus laid down his life for this. And so in their context, this very much would have made sense of going, okay, you're going to think and take the attitude of a slave even though you're a citizen. But for the Roman world, they hear that stuff and that just scares the socks off of them. That's toppling their entire society. But that's what we're seeing as far as the way it's getting used in the New Testament. There are 4 instances of the noun tapenonosis. Occurs in Luke 1:48, Acts 8:33, Philippians 3:21, and James 1:10. In each, we find the word referring in some way to the state of being lowered socially and or physically. And here, this word, tapenonosis, literally the best translation would be humiliation. And humiliation is different than humility. Humiliation is something where somebody else is doing this to you, and it's actually a negative. And so I remember Dee Dickerson was asking about this, and this is the part where when we're building our understanding of humility, we have the idea of humility being humble-minded, taking the position of a slave, and it needs to always be distinguished from the issue of humiliation, where somebody else comes and then pushes us down. And that's where one of the calls as Christians is for us to be on the side of the humiliated. When somebody gets pushed down, we're going to come and we're going to help pick them up. I want to move on. So we look at all of the uses of the tapenos word group. And I'm not ready yet to give a definition to it, because as I've been looking at the words, I've been noticing this tension that there's things going on that I don't understand as far as just historical context. Why isn't an anti-virtue? There is a clear difference between praus and tapenos. And so we're going to come to that in our next section, where we talk about honor-shame culture and getting a clearer picture of the historical context. And it is a necessary part of just building our understanding of the biblical idea of humility. But before we do that, we're going to look at the word group for leader in the New Testament. And this is going to be a little bit shorter. We're building a theology of humility and leadership. But as we look at the issue of leadership in the New Testament, there's a few interesting observations to make. An important article entitled Translating the Language of Leadership, Paul Ellingsworth argues that the category of leadership represents a real challenge of translation, because this category involves deep and often unconscious presuppositions about society as a whole. And the reality is that if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, you can still do word studies, and you can do them very effectively. But what you're going to start with is you're going to start with English translations if you speak English. But what you'd want to do is you'd want to have a number of different translations. And there you would sit there and you would take all those different translations, and you would want to have a concordance where you could look up the word leader, and then you could see in all the occurrences in this translation where it occurs. And then you'd want to do the same thing with another translation. And if you were to do that exercise on the issue of leader and leadership in the New Testament, you would find something very surprising. So let's start with our earliest English translation of the Bible that we have, that is still commonly used and in print, the King James Version of the Bible. And you decided, I want to do a study on leader and leadership in the New Testament, and I've got my King James Bible out, and I want to look at all of the occurrences of lead and leadership and get some idea of how it gets used in the New Testament. Guess what? It would be really easy. It only happens one time. The word leadership only occurs one time in the King James Version. Now, let's say that your favorite translation is the Message. It's a more modern translation. It speaks in kind of common English. It's readable. It does more interpretation than a word-for-word translation. And let's say you started there and you said, okay, I want to do a word study on leadership, and I want to look at all the uses of leadership in the New Testament. And then let's say you talk to somebody who they like the King James, they go, oh, it's not going to take you any time at all. Here, look at this verse. But then you did it, you had your little concordance, and you went through, and what you would find is that there are 98 verses in the Message that uses the word lead or leadership. And you go, how does one translation use only one occurrence in the New Testament, and the other one has 98 occurrences? And so, guess what? In looking just at the words for lead and leadership in the New Testament, I suddenly realized, there's more going on here. And so what's going on? Different translations set different goals for their work. Some literal word for word, others a dynamic equivalent, where we're going to do some interpretation if we think that you'll not understand the word for word. And some of them are even thought for thought. The interpretive decisions has a direct correlation with the number of occurrences of the word lead or leadership in a given translation. And I've actually done this work. I didn't find it. I actually did it. I went through the ESV, the Good News Bible, the King James Version, the Message, the New American Standard Bible, the Net Version, the New Contemporary Version, the NIV, the New Living Translation, the NRSV, and the RSV. And in each one, I list how many times the word lead or leadership occurs in the New Testament. The King James, 1 time. And what you'll find is the more literal translations that are trying to give word for word will have fewer occurrences of this concept of lead or leadership. So the King James Version has 1, the ESV has 6, the NASB has 8, the RSV has 7. As you move forward into what is less word for word and more dynamic equivalent, where sometimes we could use the word, but if we use the literal translation, you'll probably miss the meaning. So we'll translate it. We start to see the increase of the word lead and leadership. So the NIV has it 43 times, and the NRSV has it 33 times. And both of those are examples of dynamic equivalence. The Good News Bible is a thought for thought. It only has it 40 times. The Message is a translation, but it really is trying to render it in the way that we speak today, so it has 98. And this is where, when we come to this, looking at the words for lead and leadership in the New Testament, in the ancient world, it was primarily positional. There were kings and emperors, and they were in charge, and they were the leader. And so a lot of it has to do with just the title and the position. In our day, when we think about lead, we often think about it as leadership. And we think about qualities and traits and not so much position, because we know that somebody could be in a position of leadership, but they don't really exemplify leadership. And it is a much more ubiquitous and common way of just processing and analyzing the world. Probably in a little bit doing with our egalitarian society, where we know we all start out at equal, but sometimes we get called up into positions of leadership. So when you look at the source of the differences, 2 obvious reasons present themselves. The first explanation, and probably the most important, is that many translations are desiring to avoid technical terms, especially in more common language translations, that would not be understood, in some cases even misunderstood. And let me give you an example of something, and this is actually an Old Testament example, but it's an example of something. The most common way that we translate or our designation for in the Old Testament of the Spirit-inspired leaders that got raised up after the conquest and before a kingship, we call them judges. Really not a very good translation of the Old Testament idea. Warlord would be a better translation of it. And so we come to the book of Judges, and we think about people with black robes, and then suddenly we're confronted with this left-handed judge who spears a king through the belly, and it's not quite what we expected. But if we had heard the word warlord, we would have gone, oh, okay. And then we might have been surprised that they were there to uphold justice and to make rulings, but they really were. In the New Testament, we have a number of positional leaders, and this, for example, you'll find in the book of Acts, where Paul is going on his missionary journey, and he's dealing with different people. Sometimes it's a tetrarch, sometimes it's a governor, and in the Greek, they're giving us the technical terms, but sometimes we don't even know what that technical term means. And so some of our translations say, well, it was a person who was a leader. And so instead of giving you the technical term, it just says leader. And then you don't get caught up going, what is a tetrarch? I have no idea. Let me pull out something. And so you keep reading because you get the basic idea. You may not know exactly their authority. You may not know exactly what they were doing, but you know that they had power and they were doing something like that. So the major reason that the word leader and leadership occurs so often in some of these translations is it's taking a technical term and just giving you this generic position of lead or leadership so that you kind of have a simple category understanding. Second, and this is significant, leadership language is utilized to clarify that the reference were to the leaders of a group instead of to the whole group. And so one of the things that happens in the Gospel of John is sometimes John will be sitting there and he'll be talking about different groups, and and literally in Greek he's just making a reference to the Jews. The Jews were doing this. But in that reference, in the context, in reality, he wasn't speaking of the entire Jewish nation. He was really speaking of the leadership of the Jewish nation. And so sometimes translations will come in and they'll sit there and they'll take the word the Jews and they'll instead substitute it with the word leaders so that you understand it was the religious leaders who were really doing this and not the entire people group. There is, however, a third possibility, and Ellingsworth offers this. One must ask whether frequent use of the language of leadership may not mask a subtle, no doubt unconscious form of transculturation in which our presuppositions from modern, especially Western democratic society, are projected onto an ancient and principal hierarchical form of social organization. The danger of such projections are recognized by sociologists who speak of the problem of incommensurability in making cross-cultural comparisons. And this is where, when we come to even the study of leadership, what we suddenly realize is that the ancient world isn't like the modern world. And there is a chasm. There is something markedly different about how they understood leadership, the way that they practiced leadership. And so they had all these titles, and our simple categorization is to say that they were a leader. But if we bring in our cultural ideas of leadership and equate them with their ideas of leadership, just by giving those titles, we may miss something. And so this calls for greater clarity. And so just like with humility, so with leadership, we need more historical context. And there is one specific context that's going to help us with this, and it is understanding the honor-shame culture of the Greco-Roman world. Question. Yes.
Dee asks, how is the decision made to what version a Bible is translated to?
Oh, so this is a question about translation, about how does a decision get made about how they're going to do it. Every modern translation will have an introduction, and they will explain to you their theory of translation and what they chose to do. And some of it is to fill a gap, and some of it is just your bias of saying, we want to get God's words into people's hands, and we want to give God's people the very best access that we can. There's a couple parts to this. Overall, if you're only going to read one translation, I would recommend a translation that's something with the dynamic equivalent. where you're going to be trusting a little bit on the scholarship, the scholars who made that translation, to say there's going to be times where if I just get the word-for-word translation, I'm going to miss the meaning. Idioms of language change. I'll use Spanish because I took 4 years of Spanish. In Spanish, you don't say I am hungry, you say I have hunger. And so literally in Spanish, you say tengo hambre, I have hunger. But if I read tengo hambre and then I'm translating it to you and you speak English, I'm not going to sit there and say I have hunger. I'm going to say I'm hungry, and I'm just gonna make that leap for you. And that's a difference of just idiomatic expression. Now you might not even call that dynamic equivalent. You just might really just say I'm just translating from this, but it's not a literal word for word. If I want to do a literal word for word, then I would say I have hunger, and we don't speak that way in English, but you would know that's what they said. And then you might say, why do they speak that way? Well, that's just the way that their understanding is. Now, the NASB is one of our literal word-for-word translations. So it wants to give you the literal word for word. It tells you up front. And so if there's times when you're reading it and you sit there and you go, that's kind of an odd way to say it, it's because they want you to know how it was said in Greek or in how it was said in Hebrew, and realize there may be differences and you could do some study. But if you don't know the original languages, this is going to help you do some study, because you could go to a commentary, because you go, what's really going on here? You won't get that quite so much with the dynamic equivalent, but it'll probably be easier to read. And that's where I say if you only are going to choose one, then I do something that's more dynamic equivalent. The ESV, the NIV, and so ESV is English Standard Version, NIV is New International Version, and the NRSV is another dynamic equivalent, and what is the other one? The New Living Translation is a little bit more, but it's a little bit towards the dynamic equivalent. It gives a little bit more thought for thought, but it's in that spectrum as well. So if you're to choose one, I'd choose one of those if you're just going to read one. If you start to collect a few different, you're going to want to have one that's more literal. You're going to want to have a dynamic equivalent. And then you might get into something like the Message would be an example, where you're going to listen to a translation that's giving more interpretation, but it may capture some ideas that you wouldn't think of, and it would help you. And so when you look at those translations, they'll have the explanation of what they're doing, and they'll tell you why. And again, my perspective is dynamic equivalent for one makes sense because you're going to have to trust them a little bit, but we're always trusting the scholarships. The other thing to know is when you look at this, you're looking at the issue of modern translations are done by committee. So there's a team of scholars. The Message is an exception, just one person. So you don't put as much weight on that one translation as you would where there's a whole school of people who are working together and they're all experts in the field. Our modern translations across the board are very good. And some of it just goes down to personal preference. My two favorite that I read are the NIV and the ESV. But find the one that works for you. Okay, with that, let's. I'm gonna keep going with this. I want to make one final point on this part about lead and leadership. In trying to develop a working New Testament theology of leadership, as important as words are, this work is going to rely on listening to passages where authority, greatness, honor, responsibility are examined with keen sensitivity from historical analysis. It is interesting to note that most of the language used in reference to Jesus implied a stronger authoritarian position that is typical of modern conceptions of leadership. We live in an egalitarian society, and while there are differences, and while there are people who have, whether they're elected or whether they achieve some level of leadership and people look up to them, we basically function that all people are created equal. That's not how they viewed it in the ancient world. And when you listen to the titles given to Jesus in the New Testament, the titles given to Jesus are very authoritarian of he's in charge, you're not, he's above, you're below. Your expectation from the titles is here is somebody who has the right just to tell me what to do, and my only thing should be to do what he tells me to do, and there's no say in the matter whatsoever. So let me give you examples. In Luke, the word that we get in Greek is epistata, and it gets translated most commonly as master. And this is what, in Luke's gospel, the disciples call Jesus. They say master. And in that hierarchical society, he was above them, they were below him, he was their master, he was and they were his disciple. And in the Greco-Roman context, the expectation is just subservience. He's better than you. Do what he tells you. That's the position that you're in. Now, one of the things to know is Luke was writing the gospel to a Greek audience, and he was translating Aramaic ideas and concepts into Greek. And the word master, epistata, is actually Luke's Greek equivalent to the Aramaic rabbi. And so in Luke, you don't hear rabbi, you hear master. And here you see him doing a little translation, taking this Aramaic, which at its root is a Hebrew word, and he's explaining it to the Greek audience so that they get the conception right. Another title that's given to Jesus is Lord, Kyrios. And this title is the title of ruler. It's one of the titles that refers to king, monarch, in charge. And again, very much in that entire context, authoritarian, absolute power. The third term is what we get in Matthew, Mark, and John. We get the disciples calling Jesus their rabbi. Now, when you see rabbi in Matthew, Mark, and John, what you're getting there is a transliteration into Greek. They're saying you're going to have to do a little bit of work. Here's the word. It's an Aramaic word that comes from a Hebrew root, and so you're going to have to dig down to figure out what it means, because it's not a Greek word, it's an Aramaic word, and we're just giving you the Greek equivalent. So when you say it, you're really saying rabbi. Now, what does it mean? Well, the Hebrew word, which is the root of rabbi, is rab, and it means great one. And again, what you find here is very much, here's a great one, and we're not, and he's above us, and we're below. These are the titles that were given to Jesus. And what you would expect with all of this is that this is his position, this is his status. And this is where it really gets interesting when we look at the titles that were given to Jesus, and then we look at the way that Jesus acts. Jesus himself, however, very rarely used any of these designations, and preferred instead the more enigmatic Son of Man. And so this is one of these things when you get into Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus, when he refers to himself, he usually refers himself as the Son of Man. The backdrop of the Son of Man is Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, there is the promise that the beastly empires of the world are someday going to be undone, because there is going to be this one that comes from God, this heavenly being who is like a Son of Man, and he is ultimately going to rule over all of the nations and put everything right. That's the promise of Daniel 7. Now, when Jesus makes this reference to Son of Man, it was kind of an ambiguous term. It makes you think of Daniel 7, but people didn't normally make reference and say they were the Son of Man, so you weren't quite sure what to do with it. But it becomes clear that that who Jesus is and what he did, and when he makes this, Daniel 7 is the filter for us. Now, that claim of being the Son of Man is an exalted claim. I mean, it's a divine figure that's coming down who is going to rule and be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But, and this is key, even though Jesus himself identified himself as the Son of Man, even though he basically kind of eschewed the titles that they would ascribe to him, listen to this observation. Jesus is presented in the Gospels without an authoritarian tone. Even though positionally he has all authority, nowhere does Jesus call his followers and use the language of a despot, a ruler, a monarch, of the way the Greco-Romans did it. Nowhere does he call people to submit or obey. Now you may be sitting there going, wait a second, I'm pretty sure he says obey. Well, you're getting that word obey through translation, and it's not the best translation. Because the word that means submit is hupotasso, and the word for obey is hupaakuo, and nowhere does Jesus ever use those words. Instead, we find the language of invitation. Come after, come follow. And what sometimes gets translated as obey, those who obey my commands, literally what Jesus says is tereo, and it's better translated keep or guard. Keep my commands, guard my commands. These are words of life for you. Those who love me will keep what I say. But it is not me claiming because I'm above you and I'm better than you that this is what you must do. It is the language of wooing, of invitation. It is a language that allows us to make a free choice and choose not to keep, not to guard, not to follow. That is the way of Jesus in the New Testament. And so even when there's the titles, the experience of him is just different than anything that you would expect. What is so often forgotten, or perhaps just unobserved, is how Jesus' leadership was in opposition and contradistinction to the way that Caesar himself exercised authority and power. For people of Jesus' day, there were crucifixes scattered around the empire that oppressively declared the difference. As we will see, Jesus offered a radical inversion of the values of Greco-Roman culture surrounding the issues of authority, leadership, service, and humility. So, we looked at the word humility, we looked at the word leader. Leadership is a concept and idea that's present in the New Testament, but depending on translation, you're not going to have a lot of words that are going to point to lead or leadership, because mostly it was about positional leaders. They were actually the titles of a certain office that somebody held. They didn't think about leadership the way that we think about leadership, because really most people weren't in positions of leadership. Most people were in positions of just doing what they were told. But in the New Testament, we get invited into a different way of being. And it is the roots and foundations that lead to our egalitarian society, because every one of us is an image bearer. Every one of us created in the image of God, and every one of us, and I'm going to make this argument again, God wants to use us in some way that is a way of leadership, where we're going to serve and we're going to help others understand how to use power, not to oppress, not to push down, not for selfish ends, but to actually lift other people up. Now, to understand the concepts of humility and leadership and what Jesus was doing in this society, we're going to have to understand the honor-shame culture of the Greco-Roman world. And, I'm going to laugh because, as I was getting started on this today and just kind of reading through my notes and studying and looking at this, I was really hopeful we were going to start getting into the New Testament today, which meant that we would have fully dealt with the entire honor, shame, culture, historical background stuff, and we're not even going to get through all that today. I apologize Give me your feedback. Tell me if this stuff is interesting to you. Tell me if you're finding value, and if it's too pedantic, if it's too nuanced, let me know. I want to hear the feedback from you. So let's talk about honor and shame, and in particular, we're going to just start with the issue of status. Every society in recorded history has ended up with different classes of people. While modern Western civilization prides itself on being an egalitarian society where all people have equal rights and are of equal worth, this thin veneer of advanced society is easily smeared when a person from the upper class with great wealth can hire a team of lawyers in a dispute with a person from the lower class who has lesser means. And in a situation like that, we know that the person who has great wealth and the team of lawyers will probably get better justice, and it will not feel equal to the justice of the person who only has a court-appointed lawyer. Yeah, it's mostly equal. And one of the things that's right in the news today, and it's one of the things that, in our congregation, and if you are a white American, what's happened with George Floyd, and the reality is that we live, if we're white, we're part of the majority culture. Some of the scales of society are just tilted towards us, and we look at this and we go, there is still inequalities. And while I think most Americans are hold up the ideal that all people are created equal, and we move beyond the idea of distinguishing between racial classes and making arguments that some races aren't fully human. In our society today, not everybody gets treated the same. And this is the way that it's always been. It's part of the fallenness of the human world. And as Christians, what we're going to see is we get called to a different way of being. And it wants to overturn and disrupt this sort of societal divisions between the lessers and the greaters, and those who get more justice and those who get less justice. Now, here is an observation to make, though. We look at a situation like a person who's poor, who gets a court-appointed lawyer up against somebody who is rich and has a team of lawyers. And in the end, the team of lawyers ends up going to school with the other lawyer, and the man ends up getting the ruling in his favor because the whole deck was stacked against this other person. Most all of us look at that situation today, and we know that it's wrong. We look at that, and when it happens, and we see something like that happening, when we look at the situation of George Floyd, I don't know if you've seen the video, but watching that police officer sit on his neck with his knee for 5 minutes as he was asking to get up so that he could breathe, we look at something like that and we say, it's wrong. In the ancient world, they didn't feel that. They didn't think that. Now, if you were at the lower end and you were really experiencing injustice, you could cry out to God. But the whole way of society was, well, it's just the way that it is, and it's probably the way it should be, and there you go. They didn't feel guilt. They just accepted it. And that is part of the difference as far as when we think about the way that we have been influenced by Jesus to such a degree that we see humility as a positive. And when we see these inequalities and we see this sort of thing working out, there's something inside of us and by and large they did not have that in the ancient world. And so when we come and we read the New Testament, this is the part where we go, I'm entering into a different culture. They do things different than I do. I can't just assume the way they look at the world and the way I look at the world is the same. In stepping back into Greco-Roman culture, we must leave the values and assumptions of egalitarianism behind. This type of equality would have been viewed as a threat to Greco-Roman society. They would literally have looked at our society and they not only would have seen it as dangerous, they would have seen it as wrong. It is not the way the world is supposed to be. I'll give you an example. Pliny the Elder once explained to a governor in Spain, he was encouraging him to keep clear distinctions in social classes. Nothing is more unequal than equality itself. We are not the same. We are different. I have different rights. I have different justice. I'm better than those people down there. And it would be unfair and it would be wrong for them to get my justice because I am great and they are small. That's how the ancient world was. The Roman Empire was highly stratified, clear boundary markers to distinguish the different classes of society. And it was Roman citizens who were most concerned about safeguarding those markers that clarified the difference between social classes. Those at the top of the pecking order, writes Hellerman, jealously guarded their social privileges. These markers, clothes, titles, citizenships, clan, where one sat at a table, a banquet, or a sporting event. Now I want you to just think about that. We're going to end here. But this week, as you're reading the New Testament, especially if you're in the Gospels, if you come across things where it's talking about where somebody sits at a table, or let's say that it's talking about getting clothed in the robes that Jesus provides because we're saved, realize that that has greater cultural weight and significance for everybody listening to that in Jesus' day than we do today. Highly stratified society. Only citizens could wear robes. Only senators could wear certain colors. Everything was marked out and there were rules. And if you flouted those rules, it could be your very life. They guarded these things. Where you sat at the table. Think about the story of Jesus sitting down with the Pharisees and then the woman coming and washing his feet and realizing just how significant it was. Think about in 1 Corinthians where you hear how they were gathering to celebrate the Lord's Supper, and some people are eating a lot of food and other people are just eating the scraps. And then what you picture is that this was in somebody's home, which was a larger home because they were somebody great in society, and everything was thought about where you get to sit. And so with that, we will end for tonight. Let me, I guess I want to put a promise, come back next week. It's going to get really interesting. Not only are you going to learn about honor, shame, society, but we're going to start looking at some of the key New Testament passages that deal with leadership and humility. And we're going to read it through this honor, shame culture and then dig down into those passages. And I think that even if you've studied those passages before, there's a great likelihood that you're going to learn a whole bunch of things, and it's going to really help fill in our understanding of humility and leadership. Thanks for tonight, and God bless, and I will see you later.